Hi there and welcome back to the channel. Thanks very much for joining me. Today I want to have a bit of a serious chat about the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, which we're in the middle of at the moment, and runs until, technically of course, till the end of October, because this was a conflict that was without doubt probably the most important single battle of World War II. Not Stalingrad, but we'll talk about that later. B, it ran for 4 months. It ran from early July until the end of October 1940. And the stakes in this battle could not have been any higher. The fate of the world was decided in the Battle of Britain. The Battle of Stalingrad that came later, yes, that was almost equally important, but had the Battle of Britain been lost, I think there'd have been only one outcome at Stalingrad, and we'll talk about that in some detail at the end. So there's a lot of people today who, perhaps through lack of education or lack of knowledge, or just the fact that perhaps people are not talking about it so much as they used to, don't really understand the significance of what happened. They don't really understand the detail. They don't really understand the savagery of the struggle in the air that took place over the south of England in the summer of 1940. Quite a beautiful summer from all accounts. Now, many people don't understand that the numbers involved were much bigger than people think. There was over 10,000 men over those 4 months involved in this struggle, and it was a brutal and relentless campaign. Day after day, aircraft were coming over to the UK from France, where the Nazis had set up all their airfields right across the north of France, from Normandy right across to Belgium. And they would come over in flights of hundreds and hundreds of bombers, escorted by 70 to 100 fighters in many cases. And they would attack factories, they would attack the docks, they would attack shipping in the Channel. They would be bombing, they weren't bombing civilian targets so much at that time, that came later, we'll talk about that as well. And then they were attacking the RAF's airfields in August of 1940, and that's when things really started to get very dangerous for the UK and the future of Britain and the world, I think. Now, in terms of the numbers, there was actually something like 2,000 planes that the RAF had at the time, which sounds a great deal, but half of them were bombers. 1,000 of them were fighters. The other 1,000 were bombers. There was coastal command planes. There was a lot of biplanes still in use. For example, the fairy Swordfish, that was used effectively in certain circumstances, but no match for the Luftwaffe. Not going to be effective in the Battle of Britain, and couldn't be used, quite frankly. Beyond that, we had on the bomber force, we had a couple of hundred Wellington Bombers, which was new then in 1940. And the Wellington bomber was actually quite good, but it wasn't very effective in terms of its payload capacity. It's quite small, and the majority of the bombers were things like the Fairy Battle, which was a terribly outdated plane, the first monoplane bomber really. Not able to carry much weight of bombs, slow, not able to achieve great altitude, not manoeuvrable, no, just forget about it. So really these aircraft were not useful to us. So really we had 1,000 fighters, and of that 1,000 fighters, I think the numbers are about, there's about 200 Bolt and Paul Defiants, there's about 400 Spitfires, and there's about 400 or 500 Hurricanes, thereabouts, mainly Hurricanes. In fact, I think it was about 300 Spitfires, and then they ramped up the production rapidly because they realised the Spitfire was the plane we needed the most. And this is why, of course, in the battle itself, that the Hurricane was a good aircraft. It was quite light, but it was a little bit less manoeuvrable, and therefore this is why they decided to pitch them in against the bomber. So when the Nazi bombers came over, the Heinkel 111s, which we've got one of over here, the Matchbox kit that I'm hopefully one day going to build, that was the most prolific of the German bombers. And the Hurricane, and here we've got one over here, that was definitely the plane to send in against them. I mean, the Hurricane could take on the Messerschmitt 109, but it didn't have the speed of the 109 or the Spitfire, and therefore, if it was a skilled 109 pilot, even a really good Hurricane pilot was going to struggle from time to time. So they really sort of started to focus the Spitfires on taking on the fighter escorts, and they, as I say, they sent the bombers in to be attacked by the Hurricane. And the Bolton Pole Defiant, well, I think the less said about it the better. This is a plane that looks a bit like a Spitfire. People often confuse them with Spitfires when the pictures appear in the daily papers, you know, and they have an anniversary and they say, oh, here's a fleet of Spitfires, and it's a Bolton Pole Defiant. And you can always tell, because this aircraft is like a Spitfire with a gun turret behind the pilot, a gun turret straight out of a bomber, which made it very ungainly and heavy, a lot of weight high in the aircraft, not in a good place, wasn't very quick, wasn't manoeuvrable, and the Messerschmitt 109s that the Nazis sent across had them for breakfast, quite literally. Anyway, so the battle, the basic sort of way the battle played out, it's quite interesting when you look back historically, if you study it, and I've always been very interested in this subject. The start of the Battle of Britain, the Nazi Germany had overwhelming superiority, as I said, 3-1 advantage in numbers, but they also had better tactics. The actual experiences that they had from other earlier conflict in the war. Of course, they fought in the Spanish Civil War in 1937, which gave them a lot of knowledge of how to use their aircraft, and they'd had the aircraft, the 109, for 3 years. So they were new in the Spanish Civil War. They developed their tactics from there. And that helped them a great deal with the experience. And of course the RAF pilots had no experience. The first experience they got was the Battle of France, and they were getting absolutely torn to pieces over there because they didn't have the right tactics. They were operating in difficult conditions at longer range, a bit like the Nazis were over England. And we just didn't have the know-how, and we had a very rigid structure in terms of the discipline that was expected in terms of the flight formations and things like that. I've got a couple of books here I'm going to allude to. There's an excellent one I have here. I'm just going to see if I can find the right page for you where, well, we got it there actually. Just saw it already what I'm looking for. This is the typical official Air Ministry approved formation of 3 aircraft very, very close together in a V for Vic, as they used to call it. Now this looked very impressive at air shows, but when these guys are out up in the sky in a battle, having 3 planes in that formation, so it's basically, I've got my little Spitfires and things here, so I've got 2 Spits and remove the Nazi, 2 Spits and a Hurricane, so they're expected to fly quite literally in similar sort of spacing that you see with the models here, which is no spacing at all really. I mean, they are very, very close. That's probably about it there. Now that is just too close. Now the Germans, on the other hand, they'd started off with this and realised it didn't work 3 years earlier, so they flew in 2 pairs in echelon, so they would fly stepped back further apart, 2 and 2. And this enabled them to have much better visibility. They didn't have to concentrate on not crashing into the aircraft that they were just a couple of metres away from. And this gave them a lot of time to think, time to see the enemy, and it meant that they weren't a big target. In fact, the Germans actually started describing the RAF early in the battle. The formation, the Vic formation, they said it was the formation of idiots, because they could literally fire a burst and hit all 3 aircraft in one burst, proving that this didn't work. And later people like Douglas Bader and I think Stamford Tuck, other British aces, just dropped this, knowing that this was, once you got up there in the heat of battle, this was deadly. And despite that was the orders, they just ignored it, and they wanted to survive, and for the sake of the country it's a good job they did. But it was much later before this rule of how they should fly in formation was actually changed. It was about 1941, so a lot of young pilots following the rules, doing as they were told, were instant victims to, you know, our old friend the Messerschmitt 109. Here he is, which was an agile fighter with a lot of power, supercharged engine, fuel injected engine, by the way. That was quite important as well in the battle. 2 things that the Messerschmitt had that was an advantage over both the Spitfire and the Hurricane. It could, because it's fuel injection, it could climb very, very fast. It was the fastest climber, and it could literally push forward and just dive. Now the Spitfire and Hurricane couldn't do this, and the reason they couldn't do it is that in the Merlin engine, in the Spit and the Hurricane, because it shares the same engine. There was a problem with the carburettors, and if they're in a dogfight with a 109 like so, 109 dives, ignore he's got his wheels down, he dives into a steep dive, Spitfire follows him. As he does the dive, this creates a negative G, and you feel weightless when you're in the plane. But it also created a problem where it meant that the carburettors in the Merlin engine would flood the combustion chamber, and this would cut the engine, flood the engine, and it would cut, and it could either kill the engine completely or it would temporarily cut it, and the Messerschmitt would be gone, and who knows, maybe back on your tail. And then this was becoming a real problem, because it wasn't a fuel injected system like you have on modern cars even. This meant that this was a big disadvantage for the Spitfire and Hurricane, and in fact it was actually solved by a lady who, I can't remember her name, so you'll forgive me, I'll just check this. Oh yes, it was a lady called Miss Tilly Schilling. Now she actually invented something that became known as Miss... I'm going to read this out of Wikipedia so that people don't think I've made it up. Miss Schilling's orifice, which sounds quite rude, I have to say. But what she designed was like a little float valve that was the shape of a thimble, so not unlike the tip of your finger, inside the carburettor, and it stopped this fuel flooding back suddenly. And it temporarily resolved the problem. It still didn't give it quite the performance of the Messerschmitt, but it didn't cut out anymore. And this lady was a genius, obviously, because she actually developed it, and then she developed it further into, from being this shape of a thimble, she made it into just like a washer with a nick in it, and it had the same effect, and they developed it very carefully. And this helped the RAF to get around this quite serious shortcoming that the Merlin engine in the Spitfire and Hurricane had. And then later Rolls-Royce developed, she worked for Rolls-Royce obviously, and Rolls-Royce developed a pressurised carburettor, and then later in the war they had fuel injection as well, so these problems then completely went away. But it was a real difficulty in the Battle of Britain, because it sounds like the Germans had all the advantages. They didn't. So obviously, I mentioned that the Hurricane is a bit slower. It's got a very thick, deep wing chord, so it wasn't as aerodynamic as the Spitfire. Generally not as aerodynamic. That was one of the key reasons. But the Spitfire was super slippery as a shape. You can see this. We got this nice Tamiya FX type model here. It's Tamiya, sorry. Now this has got a very thin chord to the wing, a very thin cross section aerofoil, and yet when you compare the two aircraft with the German 109, look how much deeper. Look how much deeper the actual thickness, depth of the wing is. It's much deeper and it's much wider with its elliptical shape, and it's got much bigger ailerons. If you look very carefully, the Spitfire's is about twice as deep as the little spindly ones on the back of the 109's trailing edge here. Now what this meant was the Spitfire could turn very effectively, better than either of the other two planes. Tight turns. So 109 would go into a turn to escape from attacking Spitfire, and the Spitfire would basically out-turn him, get ahead, shoot him up. And this was the great advantage of the Spitfire. In a skillful pilot's hands, he could out-turn the MU-109, shoot him down. And that was the thing that made the Spitfire the king in the Battle of Britain, really. Especially once they conquered these other issues that I mentioned with the carburettor. Anyway, we're digressing. But I was so talking about the tactics. Obviously, I got into the engines and the performance of the planes there. But talking about the tactics, the German tactics in the sky were very good. What was not so good with the Germans was the strategy, which they kept on changing. And this is probably, sort of touch wood, why we won the Battle of Britain. May have been the biggest factor of all. Initially, the tactic was to, as I said, in July and August, was to bomb all the refineries, bomb the radar towers. Now radar was the other big advantage, apart from the Spitfire that we had. The UK, Great Britain had the new technology then, radar, it hadn't been used before, and we had this sequence of radio transmitters all along the south coast and all up the north-east coast, and it was called the chain home system, and this gave us early warning of about approximately 10 to 12 minutes of early warning that the Germans were coming, and which direction they were coming from and heading to. And then they had the Royal Observer Corps, which was about, I think it's about 2,000-3,000 men in total all around the country who were just sitting there with binoculars, and they would report exactly what type of planes, what the heading was, and how many there were, what the strength was. So this was like, they knew where to look because of radar, and then they reported what they could see. Straight filtered into the... It was described as an early intranet system, really, because it was a network of data. That information was fed to Fighter Command. They fed it to the Spitfire and Hurricane squadrons on the ground, and they would take off to intercept immediately. And what you note, I've got a book here that's a particularly good one actually in terms of the way it portrays some of these actions day by day. Don't know if you'll pick up on the camera there. I won't zoom in because it will be too difficult. But basically, it shows the swarms of these German flights, and it gives you the numbers. It gives you a very good representation of how many were in each one. What you notice is that the defending Royal Air Force fighters are tiny little groups of 6 here, 5 here, just sending up what they think will be enough, and then of course they would, if they were struggling or they're losing, they would send up more. So they didn't waste them by sending up large numbers. But this caused a lot of argument within Fighter Command. You had 11 Group was the southeast area, designated area group for the Royal Air Force for that defence of the southeast, and you had 12 Group who were further north from sort of East Anglia north up to Yorkshire. And 12 Group were led by a guy called Trafford Lee Mallory, and he believed in a strategy called the Big Wing. In other words, he wanted to get several squadrons to group up together, so there'd be 30, 40, 50 planes, and then attack the Germans en masse. Now, this was very effective at knocking down large numbers of German aircraft, but it took a lot of time to assemble all these squadrons from different places and get them in the right place together. It would take, 40 minutes. And the trouble is, the Germans would have been and already dropped their bombs by then. He felt that that didn't matter. He wanted to just annihilate them so they didn't come back. Not much fun if you're on the ground being a target for the bombing, of course. So that's a bit of an issue. And there was a big row. In fact, it's covered in the film, The Battle of Britain. There's a very good scene which is very authentic, where Trafford Lee Mallory and Keith Park, who's in charge of 12 Group, he is very not happy with this at all, and he said, no, we need to hit them in small groups, like it shows here with this repeated attacks from small numbers, so that they never get a rest, and we get them before they drop their bombs on London or on the airfields. He was particularly concerned about the airfields, because in mid-August, they had 15th of August 1940, you had Adler Tag, Eagle Day. This was the day when they wanted to wipe out the Royal Air Force on the ground. They were going to knock out every fighter station in the southeast, and they came quite close. It was a sustained, astonishing level of unleashing. In fact, there's a diagram on it here. Here we are, Eagle Day. You can see the numbers, how they're absolutely pounding. They also attacked northeast England on the same day, which is also depicted in the Battle of Britain movie. Christopher Plummer is the wing commander in that one. You'll recognise the scene. But they're attacking Hawkinge, they're attacking Folkestone, they go for Biggin Hill, Kenley, and attack all these places, Hornchurch, all on the same day. And this is when things got very serious, because if they'd have continued to do this, literally day after day, the Royal Air Force would have been wiped out. They were just being overwhelmed by the sheer attacks, the numbers of planes coming over, and the fact that they got nowhere to land, and they've got no base, or the planes have been destroyed on the ground. Pretty soon you run out of planes, and they only had about I think one day they were down to about 400 or 500 planes, and obviously new ones were arriving all the time, and we had the advantage, of course, of our planes would get shot down. If the pilot survived and wasn't injured, he could parachute back and be in a brand new Spitfire the next day, which is home advantage. Whereas the Germans, if they got shot down, they were going to be prisoner of war. If they survived, prisoner of war, and they're out of it completely, so they've just had to bring in more men and more planes, which is easier said than done when you've got this high attrition rate, huge numbers of people being killed, wounded. The training takes time. This is the biggest problem for the Royal Air Force. It wasn't the planes. We were very efficient at making the planes, replacing them, but training pilots, that was another matter. That took a lot of time, and it was proving to be the greatest fear. We just run out of pilots that could actually have the skill to continue the battle. Anyway, going back to the original point I was making about strategy. We had some very bad tactics in the Royal Air Force. The Germans had great tactics, as in battlefield tactics, but the strategy of the Royal Air Force, the overall strategy, was brilliant because you had this brilliant system of focused. It was almost like death for the Luftwaffe by 1,000 tiny incisions, because we were making these tiny small attacks with just a handful of planes, but just at the right time, just at the right place, sending them packing. Whereas they were just throwing more and more and more, and they were losing more and more. They were losing at a 3-to-1 ratio, pretty much. Certainly in August, they were losing 3-to-1, literally, which was not sustainable for the Luftwaffe, because it just meant they were going to run out of planes, And they were finding it difficult to keep production going, and the south of England was being littered with crashed German planes all over the place. It must have been astonishing to live at that time and see these things, because there was. I think the kids, in Kent, it was almost like on the summer holidays they'd be riding the bikes round and they'd hear about another one or see one come down. They'd go riding off to see. Obviously the police would be there and everything, but there would be several they'd see in a day that would be coming down, and it'd be falling from the sky like confetti, especially on the 15th of August. Anyway, the Germans, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, our very large friend, he actually gave a diktat that said they must never attack the same target for 2 days on the run, because he was frightened that the second day the RAF would just be waiting to destroy them. Don't make the same mistake twice. In actual fact, he was wrong, of course, and we couldn't have sustained this, and if they'd carried on hitting the same target day after day, we'd have been sunk. But this is what gave us the breathing space, and a day's breathing space to be able to repair the runways. And don't forget, in those days we're taking off on grass strips, so it wasn't like a tarmac runway. It's quite easy to repair. And we just got this breathing space, and they kept changing tactics. So they had this Adler Tag the day they were going to destroy the Royal Air Force. They didn't. I'm looking at the pictures of this is actually just the morning, the picture I just showed you from this book. Now we have the late afternoon where they come across from Normandy and they're attacking the Isle of Wight, they're attacking airfields at Warmwell, Middle Wallop, Tangmere, Odium. They're attacking everything. Every airfield is getting absolutely plastered. It must have been very terrifying, to be at one of these airfields. And the numbers of these planes, there's clearly over 100 in there, another 100 there, and it's just staggering when you see these. And then even into the evening they were still coming over. They were attacking Westmoreland, Biggin Hill got hit, Kenley was hit again, Croydon, Hurricane Base got hit. It was relentless, absolutely ferocious. And on it went. But then they became disheartened because the RAF was still showing up, and they changed tactics again. And then they stopped this attack there was a couple of days. There was a bit of a lull, and this gave us a chance to rebuild, of course. And I'm just flicking through the book a little bit there. We've got some famous quotes from one or two people saying that Keith Park was right and Lee Mallory was wrong. The one time that Lee Mallory's big wing system did work was on the 15th of September, which was the Battle of Britain Day, as we call it now. It was the biggest day, the hardest day of all, and that was the day that he actually did get the big wing. He brought them down from the north. Quite a lot of squadrons came and joined in, and he did throw in an enormous amount. It was about 80 Spitfires and Hurricanes in one flight, and they just mullered the Germans and shot down, German Nazi aircraft were falling out of the sky like rain almost. And that was the day. It was the day after that the Germans started to wind back and decided that ultimately they just couldn't beat the RAF, and they couldn't understand. They kept being told, of course, because of the propaganda, that the RAF had beaten. You've bombed their runways, and they just move as in the Battle of Britain movie. You see them getting bombed, Michael Caine's squadron, and they just move down the road to some field, which they're able to do because it's just near the coast, on the South Downs, and anywhere that's got a flat field of grass, no problem. But it was the men. It was getting the men back. So other things about the battle that people don't always appreciate. There was quite a few. It wasn't common, but there was quite a few incidents of pilots being shot up on parachutes, and some of these very ardent Nazis were really into that. They would shoot men up on a parachute, because they know that the pilot actually was the valuable commodity, not the aircraft. And they shot the aircraft down. They see the Spitfire pilot jump out, and they gun him down hanging in a parachute, which is completely against the Geneva Convention and against all sense of decency. But unfortunately, of course, this was seen by RAF pilots, and then they became very hardened, and they started to do it as well. Now, it didn't become the norm, didn't. But there's lots of stories about that where one or two said, "Yeah, I wouldn't." Just off the record, I would not let a Nazi get back if it was over the French coast. If they'd strayed across, they'd let them have it. So it all became really nasty and brutal. So very interesting times, and of course it also became, on that same subject, it was very important for the RAF to rescue their men out of the Channel. They had a lot of these rescue boats, like a high-speed launch that they had, that would be racing around trying to find any pilots that had gone down. And it was, on a good day, it was doable. Obviously, if the weather's not so good, it was going to be a real challenge to get these guys back. A lot of guys drowned in the Channel, unfortunately, from both sides, and the RAF would rescue the Germans if they saw them as well. They would rescue any man in the water, because that's the way we played the game. I did read an interesting story as well just a couple of days ago about a Junkers Ju-88 bomber that came across, and the pilots, brand new, it was only 2 weeks old apparently, and the pilots got shot down by Spitfire, but managed to crash land safely without any injuries, and they jumped out and started trying to set fire to some documents they had. It's quite a famous incident on the north coast, in the north coast of Kent, and apparently the local London Irish Rifles turned up, and they had a bit of a shootout. It's the last time there was ever a gun battle between belligerents, proper hostilities between two sides on the English soil, on British soil in fact. And this was in, I think it was September 1940. They had a bit of a shootout. The Germans had taken the machine gun out of the bomber and were shooting back. And in the end, they decided to try and shoot up their own bomber because they wanted to destroy it, so the RAF couldn't get it. But they did get it because it didn't set fire. But that was quite an interesting story. So, yeah, it's something I'd never heard of before. So that was the last ever battle on British soil between two opposing nations. There you go. Anyway, so in terms of the tactics, the battle moves on. Lee Mallory throws his big wing in. It becomes very, very stressful for the individuals involved in this. In fact, another good film, which I'll allude to some of these things at the end, but First Light is a DVD I've got here. It's from a book by Geoffrey Wellham, who sadly died quite recently. And he was one of the last of the Battle of Britain pilots. You'll know his face because he was one of the youngest in the battle, at the time. But he was very vocal and very often interviewed and told a lot of anecdotes and lots of interesting stories, and he's been on lots of programmes on TV, so you probably know of him. And he basically, by his own admission, he went through the battle. He started, I think it was July, August, I think he started right at the height of the battle. And by early 1941, after the battle had finished actually, he was just finished, and he said, I've just basically had a nervous breakdown. He said, I just couldn't take it. Imagine every morning you get up at 5, 6 in the morning, not knowing if that's going to be your last day, and having to do it again and again, every single day, for 4 months. This is going to destroy anybody, even the best pilot, and he was a good pilot, otherwise he wouldn't have survived. And in the end, he moved out of the RAF in mid-late 1941, and I think they gave him a desk job because he just couldn't handle it. And it was good that he survived. Frankly, he'd done his duty, and we should be very grateful to him and all of these other famous people. Some of them not so famous, sadly, but the names that come to mind, you think of Douglas Bader and Stanford Tuck and Bob Doe. He's quite well known. In fact, I've got a book here by his daughter, Helen Doe, called Fighter Pilot. He was a very very, very skilled ace, and some of the other guys you think of, the brain's going here. I'm just trying to remember all the names. It's so hard to remember every name. The list goes on. Al Deer, of course. Al Deer's worth mentioning. He was a New Zealander, and he had the Kiwi on the side of his plane, and his plane markings is now being used today in 2020 by the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight. They've actually painted their plane up with his colours on it, which is nice, and that was the one that used to be on the Airfix 24th scale Spitfire. So quite a memorable scheme. KLB was his registration letters, but so many of these guys that were made famous in the battle, people like Sailor Milan, And also, on the German side, they had their own aces like Mulders and Adolf Galland, who notoriously did not get on with Goring at all, and famously had this confrontation which is depicted in the Battle of Britain movie, where Goring comes in early September getting most frustrated that they still haven't gained air superiority, haven't been able to clear the skies, and he comes and he's remonstrating with his senior generals in the Luftwaffe, and he said, "You are betraying me, you've got to do your duty. You know, you must clear the skies of the Royal Air Force because the invasion, Operation Sea Lion, across the Channel, it must happen by the end of September. You must have time to do it, you know, and you must clear the Royal Navy out as well." He said, "Is there anything you need?" And of course, Adolf Galland turns to him and said, "Yes, give me a squadron of Spitfires." And this sent Goring into a rage, and he stomped off and got on his train, and he wasn't seen, I don't think, at the Battle of Britain front again. And of course, as he got to the end of September, they realised the Germans were hemorrhaging people and machines, and the numbers are actually quite staggering. It was so the RAF, they had they had about 1,000 fighters operating at any one time. They got down to about 400 or 500, which is getting very, very below 400 is getting dangerously low. You know, thinking how spread they are. Now the RAF. Say they had 1,000 planes really operationally that were fighting every day. The Luftwaffe had 2,500. In fact, the figures are slightly more than that. They had 12. I've got it written here. 1,200 fighters they had, mainly ME-109s and 110s, and they had 1,300 bombers. Well, of course, these numbers got hacked away out. And in terms of actual losses, the Royal Air Force lost 1,007 men dead. The Luftwaffe lost 2,662. Now you've got to remember the numbers overall of who was taking part. You had basically, what was it, about 2,500, 3,000 was the figure in total that the Royal Air Force fielded into the skies over the whole 4 months. Luftwaffe had about 7,500 men, and they lost a third of them. 1 in 3 dead. Absolutely astonishing numbers, really. So they actually lost 2,662 men. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Obviously, they've got bombers with more men in than one would be in a fighter, but even so, it's pretty staggering, you know. And they got to the middle of September. They just decided that it was going to be too late. Hitler then said, "I'm going to postpone Operation Sea Lion." In other words, it was cancelled. Really, I think he probably even knew this. He wanted to attack the Soviet Union. And that was now put back to 1941, summer of. And the situation that evolved really was the fact that they weren't going to give up on pounding Britain. They wanted to punish Britain, so they changed the strategy again. So we started off trying to destroy the ports, started off trying to destroy, you know, the factories. That didn't work. Then they tried to destroy the Royal Air Force. That didn't work. Then they had this massive campaign where as is depicted in the film, true story, that they had a flight of bombers at night coming over. I think they're going to attack one of the airfields. I think Croydon maybe, and the pilot got lost. It was the lead pilot, Luftwaffe Heinkel 111 bombers. He got a bit confused, and he I think there was some cloud. He circled around a bit, and they ended up over London, but didn't even know it. And they decided that they were going to go home, and they released their bombs through the cloud on the outskirts of London towards Croydon. This was actually an accident because they didn't know where they were, and they just wanted to get home, and it was, yes, we've done our job, let's get back to France quickly. Now, of course, this infuriated Churchill because he wasn't sure whether it was deliberate or not, but the fact is they dropped bombs on London, and the very next night Churchill ordered that a squadron of Wellingtons would bomb Berlin. Now, this was no mean feat because it was a bit of a stretch in terms of distance to Berlin, but they fully fueled them up. Only a relatively modest bomb load to compensate, but they wanted to say, "We bombed Berlin," and Churchill did this, and they went. A squadron of Wellingtons bombed Berlin. It's in the Battle of Britain movie, where these two guys who have bombed London are going to be rollocked by the Führer, and they get sent to Berlin immediately. And before they even get to meet the Führer, that night, the following night, they see the air raid sirens going off, and they're getting bombed by the RAF. And this kicks off the London Blitz. And this is the third change of strategy from the Germans, which is really where they come completely undone with their thinking, and their inability to pursue a single strategy is what really keeps on letting the RAF off the hook. And they start to bomb London. The London Blitz starts in October proper, and they stop bombing the airfield, and the RAF recover. They get more pilots through, they get the planes through, and then we're very quickly back up to full strength, despite all the grievous, very, very sad losses that they've suffered through a brutal summer of conflict like no other. The following year, of course, having done all this and lost a third, probably about 40% of the Luftwaffe was wiped out in the Battle of Britain. This was the biggest air force the world had ever seen, and a tiny force of a few hundred, on most days, a few hundred fighters, was able to knock out 3 planes for every one that they lost. And it was the very focused nature of the way that this was done, the strategy that was used, really made the difference. And it really was, when you think about it in the wider scheme of things. Churchill summed it up with his statement about never in the field of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. What he really said was this was the ultimate David versus Goliath conflict. Nothing has ever been seen quite like it before or since, where a little force, totally outnumbered, outgunned, who on the face of it have got no chance, actually defeated a superior enemy, and they survived. Now you have to also remember, for those of you that don't know a lot about the Battle of Britain history, we were on our own. This is actually not about the Battle of Britain, this is Darkest Hour with Gary Oldman, who plays Winston Churchill. A brilliant piece of art, that is. Very, very essential watching if you want to understand what leads up to the situation. And very good for our American friends to watch, because there's a scene in that film where he's speaking to Roosevelt, and he wants him to give him some destroyers, and I won't spoil it for you, but it shows just how alone Britain was. We were not getting support from the Americans other than loans, really, leased lend. Excuse me. The situation was that in America there was a very strong anti-war movement. There was no desire to get involved. Everybody said it's a European war, it's nothing to do with us. Well, actually, that couldn't have been more wrong. You could argue the First World War, that certainly was true, because that was ridiculous the way that started. But the Second World War, what choice did Britain have here? What choice did Britain have? Sue for peace with Germany. We know that Hitler would have just dishonoured any agreement, and he would have invaded us. And this is the important part of what I wanted to talk about in terms of the long-term scenario. What if we lost? What if they'd pounded our airfields day after day after day, and the RAF ran out of airfields, planes and men? Well, Operation Sea Lion would have happened, and Operation Sea Lion would have meant the wholesale invasion of the south of England. We would have been taken over by, the most despicable, evil, tyrannical empire the world has ever seen. I mean, the Nazis, let's be honest, whatever your politics, I think most people would agree. I mean, these people made the Romans look like saints, really. I mean, we know what happened at the death camps. They'd even taken people from Jersey to the death camps at Auschwitz and elsewhere. It was a very, very bleak situation. Had they successfully invaded the UK, think what the repercussions would have actually been. And a lot of people don't know some of the stuff I'm going to talk about now. So, the Royal Navy, which was the most powerful navy in the world, yes, even more powerful than the US Navy in 1940. US Navy very quickly built up its strength very rapidly. So by the time they got to Pearl Harbor and beyond, they were, several times bigger. But in 1940, the US Navy, wouldn't have held a candle to the Royal Navy with the number of battleships, heavy battleships that we had. We had something like 46 battleships, I think. Forgive me if I can't do the number up, but there was a lot of them. We ruled the seas. This is why we were able to destroy the Graf Spee. Well, they scuppered it because they were surrounded by our ships, but we sunk the Bismarck, we sunk the Graf Spee, we sunk the Tirpitz thanks to the RAF later. The German Navy could not hold a candle to the Royal Navy. But had the Germans invaded Britain and succeeded in the Battle of Britain, the Germans would have had that navy for themselves, and the entire British Empire. Think of all the things that Britain owned then in India and Africa, the resources, gold, tin, copper, all these things that Germany would have had, the entire British Empire plus their own empire. I tell you now, they would have crushed the Soviet Union a year later had they won the Battle of Britain, because they would just have had the resources to do it. They would have had double the strength that they already had, and they already had too much strength. Now imagine the situation for America. America came into the war, I think, far too late. I think it was almost shameful that they waited as long as. I'm not having to go at Americans, please don't think I'm, because I love Americans. I've lived next door to Americans. I've got no problem with America at all. I'm a big supporter of the USA and always have been. But this was a slightly shameful period when they really should have just thrown in with us. I mean, they had journalists in London during the Battle of Britain who were sort of trying to give the odds about whether Britain was going to collapse or not, and they were sort of hesitating all the time, feeding it back to Roosevelt about, well, we don't want to lend them too much materials because then the Germans will get them, And they didn't throw in with us until it was clear that we'd beaten the Germans. Yeah, we got support, we got cheap loans and things like that, but America held back. This is quite disappointing, I think, when you read the history properly. It's alluded to in the film, but there's lots of written documentary evidence about it. Roosevelt himself wanted to support Britain, and it was a lot of people in the House of Representatives that wouldn't support him. If he went to war, he was going to be on his own. They wouldn't support him. It wouldn't get through. And it's real frustration for him, I think, because Roosevelt was a good guy, no question about it. But there was this, almost like it's not our problem. But going back to my point, what would have happened then? So you've now got Britain is part of Nazi Germany with her massive empire, massive navy, an air force with superior planes. If the Germans had unleashed that on the United States, especially the navy, what chance would the United States have had? You've got Japan on one side. At that time, 1941-42, America could not hold her own against the Japanese until Midway, of course, when that all changed. And of course America is constantly pumping out more production with her advanced industrial mass and might. But if Britain and Germany had been as one, if it had all become part of Nazi Germany, I don't think they'd have even got that far. I think that the Germans would have crushed the Soviet Union in 1941. Absolutely no problem at all with the extra strength they'd have had. They would have had all those extra materials, they'd have had oil, everything that they needed, and a navy that could force their power and focus it anywhere they wanted in the world, including the United States. And the pact between Japan and the Nazis would mean that the Americans would be squeezed on both sides, and I think that this would have been disastrous for the future of the world. Don't want to rant on, I know I'm hypothesising and speculating here, but do not underestimate the importance of the Battle of Britain. 10,000 plus men fought a battle in the sky. The future of the world was decided right there. If that had been lost, Stalingrad would have been a cakewalk for the Nazis. Pearl Harbor would have been the beginning of the end of America, and we'd be in a very, very dark place today. It doesn't bear thinking about. The more I think about it, I sort of have nightmares about it, really. And yet here we are today. We have people, don't want to get into politics, but we have people moaning about how oppressed they are and what a terrible place the USA is and what a terrible place Britain is. These people don't know the history. They don't understand what their countries represent, I don't think. And just in case any Americans think I was having a pop at, I'm not having a pop at America. When America did come into the war, they were fantastic, absolutely marvellous. I just wish they'd come in 1940, because the war would have been a lot shorter. No doubt about it at all. However, they did come in, and we got the right result in the end. The problem for Britain was that, and again, a lot of people don't seem to realise this, they talk about the empire and how wicked it was and all this. No. The empire that was wicked was the Nazi empire. Until you've understood clearly what they were doing, what they planned to do in the future, you've no idea. It's just beyond belief. And people also forget, they talk about slavery and all this stuff. People forget that Britain is the country that first made slavery illegal. We actually abandoned slavery 50 years before the USA. But anyway, I think we should count our blessings. I think that we should also celebrate this victory, the Battle of Britain. And by the way, when I said about Americans, I just want to add one important thing, not just about the Americans either. Some Americans were so moved and so disgusted and dissatisfied with the way that their government behaved over this issue I've mentioned. They came across here, and it's mentioned in the Pearl Harbor movie, of course. The Eagle Squadron of American pilots, they came over because they could see exactly what was going to happen. They were desperate to help, and they wanted to free the world from this kind of tyranny. And they were brilliant. You know, these guys made a brilliant contribution, and it was a foretaste of things to come. And of course, later in the war, when the Americans came here and they set up the bomber bases, well, that's when things really turned around, and Germany got a taste of her own medicine. And of course, in the war over the skies of Germany, the Americans in the day and the British bombers at night, they completely turned the tables on them. And later in the sort of 1944, when the Mustang arrived, the Americans could even escort their bombers all the way to Berlin. So it was game over for Germany then, you know. Thank God. Thank God. Anyway, we're not here to knock anybody. Germany today is fine, you know, Americans are fine, everything's fine now, but don't underestimate how dark and how dangerous this time was for the world. The summer of 1940 was the pivotal moment. Until this moment, the Germans had walked across every country. They'd gone into Poland, they'd walked across, you know, Holland, they marched into Belgium, they crushed the French in a few weeks, despite the Brits trying to help them, and of course we only survived because we escaped at Dunkirk, which was a sort of victory from the jaws of defeat. Sort of, you know, but it was a very great thing that we were able to do that, and that showed the British spirit and what was to come. And if we hadn't have had that, you know, the world today would be in a very, very terrible place. And everybody should think about that, I think, in the next few weeks when you hear about these anniversaries. It's not just something that happened a long time ago. It could happen again if people allow it to. Anyway, there's my thoughts. Some things, some reading and some watching that you might enjoy and find out more. I've got to say, this is actually my favourite. I've got lots of lovely Battle of Britain books, but this is my absolute favourite because of the way it depicts in such detail, day by day, even morning and afternoon, of what exactly was going on. And this is actually a book from Salamander, The Battle of Britain, and I just cannot stress how good that is. Some other great ones, we've got our friends, some great historians, aren't there? Dr. Stephen Bungay, he wrote a very famous book. I was going to say The Narrow Margin, but that wasn't him, was it? That was Derek, I forget the names, aren't I? The Narrow Margin is the book that the Battle of Britain movie was based on. Dr. Stephen Bungay, he appears in a lot of these documentaries, and so does James Holland, and he wrote this one, The Battle of Britain. It's quite a recent book in the last 2 years, which I haven't read yet, I've got to be honest, I've not quite got into it, but I have started reading the Spitfire Book by John Nichol, who was the ex-RAF Tornado navigator who got shot down in Iraq, which we all know about. I mentioned already about the Helen Doe book about her father, Bob Doe, who was a famous Spitfire Ace. Then we've got numerous magazines are out at the moment. It's got the new Fly Pass, which is a corker. There's some absolutely stunning stuff in here. Talking in detail about some of the Germans' aces, for example. It talks about, I just mentioned Adolf Galland. And we can find the right page. Here we go. Famous 5 Germans. Mulders, Werner Mulders, I mentioned. Adolf Galland with his famous Mickey Mouse and his famous big cigars, you know. Helmut Wick, Balthazar, Walter Ossow, some famous guys there. And then this has just come out. Sorry, I've got one more book. Alfred Price is another famous expert on the Battle of Britain. There's a second book called The Battle of Britain, which you can also get on iPlayer, Kindle, etc. by Richard Overy. He's another one. It's a very good author, well known. But this is out at the moment. You can get it in the UK newsagents. It's really good. It's all in colour, so they've colourised all the original photographs, and they are really, really excellent. I really enjoyed looking through this. There's all sorts of data about the Royal Observer Corps, some pictures there of these guys with their radar stations nearby, and all the shot down aircraft, and the situation in the Blitz. Of course, something else people don't remember is just the number of casualties in the Blitz. I think we lost 14,000 people on the ground being bombed by the Germans just in the Blitz. That was into the winter of 1940. And then if you want to read, if you don't know into reading and you want to see some good movies, the Battle of Britain movie is the one, because it tells you historically and chronologically correctly, with lots of anecdotal stories that are true, all weaved into the story, and some brilliant flying as well. There's not really any CGI in there. There is one or two scenes where the effects aren't very good, but most of it is true flying. And the assembled Spitfires, Hurricanes, Messerschmitts, Bouchons, and all sorts of stuff, Heinkels even. And they flew these things for real, and it was an amazing film. You mustn't miss the Battle of Britain movie. But then two others you should definitely consider, two of my favourites. First Light, I mentioned Geoffrey Wellham, who sadly passed away recently. He was such a great ambassador for the Battle of Britain veterans. And this is his story, and it shows him as a young man. It shows him sort of cracking up with the strain of it all. And it's really a very... And he's in it as well. He features in it. It's like flashbacks and reenactment and him being interviewed. Definitely recommend that to you. That's absolutely not to be missed. And as mentioned about the American Eagle Squadron, and I didn't mention all the other great compassionate people from around the world that came to help Britain, and there's this brilliant film, there are several actually. There's one called Hurricane about the Polish pilots, which I think it's also known as 303 Squadron. My personal favourite is Dark Blue World. This is about the Czech pilots. It starts with them being invaded by the Nazis, these pilots at this airbase in Czechoslovakia, and they escape to Britain, and they learn to fly the Spitfires, and it's some of the things that happen to them. It's really good story. It's quite heartbreaking. It's really excellent. Though. Dark Blue World. Don't miss that one. Absolutely fantastic. And of course there was, I should just mention all the other nations, if I can remember them, that helped the RAF in the Battle of Britain to achieve this victory and suffered losses, nearly all of them. There was Israeli pilots, South African pilots, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, India, I think there was a Moroccan pilot, and Portuguese guy, I think there was a Portuguese pilot, Poland of course, many from Poland and the Czech Republic. Trying to think of the list. I think all the countries that I saw listed. Anybody that I haven't mentioned, no disrespect, just can't remember them, but the whole world joined the RAF really, the non-oppressed people of the world who were determined to stop this tyranny from happening, and if they hadn't done, well, the world would have been a very, very dark place today. Anyway, there we go. I don't want to go on too long because it's probably quite long as it is. But just a few thoughts, and I would urge you to check out some of the documentaries that you can see. There's a very good one that was produced by Channel 4 about 15 years ago, and it was called Spitfire Ace, and it followed 4 pilots' attempts to be trained in the same way as the Battle of Britain Spitfire pilots were. And they whittled down to just one pilot in the end who gets through and gets to fly the Spitfire solo. And it includes other famous pilots. I mentioned Bob Doe, he's in there. Pete Brothers, he was another lovely guy. He was a great pilot in the Battle of Britain, and many others. And there's a chap with a fantastic real RAF moustache. I can't remember his name unfortunately, but he's in it. And you can see this on YouTube. In fact, I'll find the link and I'll include it so you can watch it up here. You can watch that. It's not the highest definition, but it's really good, very moving, and it tells the story of the battle, and it brings a tear to your eye. It's remarkable. You do think at the end, wow, any decent person who watches this programme is going to think, at the end, you're going to think, oh my God, thank God they won, because if they hadn't, it would have been a disaster for the world, It would have been like going back to the Dark Ages. But anyway, I'll put a link in for that. If I can think of any other good ones that I think you should see, there's a movie called Spitfire, which was made 2 years ago, which I did have, but I think I've lent it to somebody, and that's brilliant as well. That tells the story of the Spitfire, and it talks about the Women's Royal Auxiliary Air Force who delivered them to the fighter stations and all that stuff. Very interesting, fascinating stuff. Anyway, enough from me. Hope you enjoyed the video. It wasn't too long. I tried to include everything I thought was interesting and worth mentioning. But it's such a huge subject. You should go and have a look into it yourself, and you'll find lots of things if you start reading books and looking at some of these documentaries that you didn't know. I always do. I mean, even this week I found 2 or 3 facts, so it's worth doing. And I think it's something that not only Britain but the whole world can be proud of. Everyone who took part of or supported us in this challenge, ultimate challenge for a nation, and it was basically a fight for freedom versus sheer tyranny. Thank goodness the right side won. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please like, share and subscribe and to the channel. And I hope in the future to have some more interesting videos coming forward for you to watch again. In the meantime, take care of yourselves and thanks a lot. Bye for now.